most of y'all know me. I'm also Dr. Wilder. I'm a joint lecturer in the Departments of Sociology and Criminal Justice and African American Studies at Old Dominion. I attend National William Salam. My presentation today is on ancient African civilizations and the influence of al-Islam in Africa. I took Shahada 2 years ago, so I'm not pretending to be a scholar or expert of Islamic studies at all. This is my disclaimer. Islam has revolutionized my life. It has given me so much balance. It is one of my passions, along with African American studies, and so I thought I would combine the two for my presentation today. The first thing that you have before you is just a little test your knowledge kind of quiz, and so it's not going to be graded. You don't have to show it to anybody, but I do want you to just kind of go through the questions and try to answer them to the best of your ability. And then at the end, you can just kind of double check your answers and we can talk about it if you want. So I guess I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Costume? So we're going to start with Surah Hujurat, 49:13. O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female. We made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Verily, the most honorable of you with Allah is the believer who has at-taqwa, the pious. Verily, Allah is all-knowing and all-acquainted. And so this is kind of going to be the running thing a little bit through the presentation, the idea that we were made different by God's design, Allah's design, so that we may get to know each other. The way that the presentation is going to run is kind of like, we'll start with very basics of information about Africa, ancient African kingdoms, some basic tenets about al-Islam, and then we'll go into the combination of the two. So this was a picture from National Geographic, which essentially details the Out of Africa migration model, the idea that all human civilization life forms began in Africa, and we migrated out of Africa throughout the various time periods, and that distinctions in our pigmentation, hair texture, etc., grew based on the climates of the various places we evolved. And so this is just a very basic, National Geographic image showing the outward progression of humans from Africa to the various parts of the world. Any questions? Okay. So Africa is al-Islam's second home. The reason why we're focusing on Africa is because since the immediately following the birth of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his recognition as prophet in Arabia, Africa was the first continent to receive Islam. So Africa was the first continent where Islam spread from Arabia in the early 7th century. It is the fastest growing religion of African descendants. A third of the world's Muslim population lives in Africa, which makes 45% of Africa's population Muslim. And then here in America, 23% of American Muslims identify as Black. And so, as you can see, there's a strong correlation between the continent of Africa and al-Islam. Yeah. And I can give anybody the PowerPoint if you want, but I can email it to you. So you don't have to rush to the top. So does that mean I can go ahead?
That means you can go ahead.
Okay, so most of this was covered in Brother Ishmael's talk Islam 101, so some of the basic tenets. Al-Islam means to surrender to the will of Allah or God. The basic principle and one of the most important concepts is the idea of monotheism or tawheed, which is just the oneness of the Creator or Allah. And from an Islamic perspective or Muslim perspective, Al-Islam did not begin with the birth of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but with God, Allah's first creation, Adam, and that all of God's creations have an inherent desire or will to submit to the will of Allah. So this is where we're kind of like, that Al-Islam is viewed as a continuation of the revelation of the Creator from Adam, peace be upon him, all the way to Prophet Muhammad. And that Islam or Al-Islam includes various aspects of indigenous Africa, Christianity, and Judaism. And that it is the Islamic belief that every nation received a prophet, that there were prophets into every nation and people. And that the distinction in terms of Prophet Muhammad is that he's the last prophet who came to perfect the religion, and that he was a prophet for all of humanity. And so although he is from Arabia and was born in Arabia, there is no special significance given to Arab culture or any particular preference for any specific culture. And so I just wanted to remind you of Surah Hujurat, the idea that we were made different by design so that we may get to know each other. And so sometimes we confuse like things that are Arab culture versus the tenets of Islam. And so I just kind of wanted to say that here as a sub-note. Okay, so some basic tenets of Islam to cover, and now we're going to talk about some just basic ideas of Africa or the continent. And I begin with like myths. So misconceptions, particularly those that were promulgated or tried to be extended in the New World of the United States as well as in Europe, that prior to Europeans coming to Africa, that there was no African history or civilization, that all the advancements in Africa are attributed to those groups outside of Africa, so the influence of Arabs or others who have came to Africa. The third myth is that the only advanced civilizations that they can't dismiss are evidenced by statues and things of that nature in Egypt or Kemet and Ethiopia, also known as Nubia, Abyssinia, Kush. And then the fourth is that Africa had no organized religion prior to the coming of Europeans. And so some of the reality is, or what we know to be the reality, if you think about that out of Africa migration map, that if we began in Africa, or life form began in Africa, we extended outwards, then obviously we were doing things in Africa before people came. Like sometimes we talk about slavery, we act as if Africans were just sitting on the shores like this, waiting for someone to come get them. So we didn't get slaves from Africa, we got Africans that enslaved them. And so we know that via our history that Africans were the forerunners in contributions to science and engineering, metallurgy, medicine, architect, animal domestication, iron smelting, tool making, wood and stone works, and other fine arts. So just like every civilization, you contribute to the evolution of those civilizations. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are just some documented notables in terms of evidence of African excellence or excelling in these various regions. And everywhere there are people, the indigenous people have some evidence to African settlement, African achievements, contact with Africa, etc. Okay, so the significance of Al-Islam in Africa and other notable mentions. For over 1,400 years, Africa has been, Islam has impacted Africa, leading to the creation of and the spreading throughout African kingdoms, including Ethiopia, Islamic Spain under the Moors, and Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. But also I want you to understand that African culture is not monolithic or stagnant. It is a huge continent. If you look on a map, most maps are illustrated very incorrectly to expand European countries to seem larger than they are and to minimize countries of color. That Africa encompasses most of the other continents on the map. So when you think about culture and the diversity of the people, there wasn't one culture, everyone didn't speak the same language. So sometimes we have a very slanted view of Africa as if there was not a lot of diversity already occurring. Coexisting with early inception of Islam, with early inception of Christianity, plus indigenous religions, etc. So I just think it's important to mention. The spread of Al-Islam in Africa. With every step towards the Islamization of Africa, there also was the Africanization of Islam. And so because Islam had been in Africa for over 1,400 years, African culture has influenced Islam to the same degree that Islam has influenced African culture. And so Africa has created its own orthodoxies around Islam that are indigenous and specific to that region. And as you know, we think about the beginning of the 7th century all the way to the end of the beginning of chattel slavery, by the time that Europeans came to the continent and started removing Africans, 13 to 15% of those enslaved Africans that came to the New World were already Muslims. And so, you know, there's evidence of, on the ships, people praying and making, offering salat and things like that, that we know that the Islamic experience in America didn't begin, wasn't something that just came later via the Nation of Islam or some other factors. Okay, so we talked about, or I mentioned the idea that it is the Islamic belief that al-Islam didn't predate the Prophet Muhammad, meaning the idea of the oneness and submission to the Creator came before the birth of the Prophet. But in terms of an organized religion and giving us specific direction through the Quran, that it came in the 6th century via the form of Prophet Muhammad being born in Arabia. At the age of 30, and via meditation, he encountered Angel Gabriel and was given the Quran over 23 years, essentially page by page. And the essence of the idea, for those who aren't familiar of Islam, is that there is no God but God, and that Prophet Muhammad is his lady prophet. But Islam recognizes several prophets that came before, including Moses, Abraham, Noah, and Jesus, and that Islam is viewed as the final revelation or the perfected religion. And it had widespread appeal because it appealed to a lot of different classes of people. It stressed brotherhood and equality, and it was extended by conquest and trade and commerce. But it also pleased a lot of people because of the rituals. Like a lot of the indigenous people who were very superstitious were pleased with some of the ceremonials and the ritual aspects of Islam as well. So it spread relatively quickly compared to a lot of other organized religions.
I think, I'm not certain, but I think Prophet Muhammad received first revelation at age 40.
That's what I thought,
42? Oh, I'm sorry.
About 40.
40 years old. Oh, thank you. It was for 23. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay, so we're shifting now to the first onset of Islam in Africa. So we know about, before I go into the role of Islam in these regions, well, I'll give you a little bit of just a summary text of what was going on in these regions. So in ancient Ethiopia, also known as Abyssinia or Al-Habasha, is what was known in Arabia, also called Kush, Nubia, the land of Put. Generally, Ethiopia is recognized as one of the first origins of civilization, the cradle of humanity, etc. The kingdom of Aksum is seen as one of the oldest kingdoms. Many of you all know I'm Ethiopian. My family's from Aksum. My mom has a restaurant in Aksum, so there's a lot of cultural pride associated with Ethiopians feeling like they're the first people who came here, and also the early onset of Christianity there. But at the height of its kingdom, it included a variety of territories, so it's not present-day Ethiopia, it's not the country just in the horn, but it expanded past various geographic territories. The word Ethiopia actually is Greek, meaning burnt face, because they were dark-skinned, that's what the Greeks called them. In terms of their economic structure, they had an agricultural or agrarian base, but they were heavily involved in trade, and outside of Egypt, they were the only African country to extend to feudalism. They specifically specialized in exporting ivory, coffee, gold, emerald, silk, and spices to India and throughout the Mediterranean. So Pedra, the first sending Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sent 23 some 23, 25 sources, Muslims to Aksum to seek refuge from the persecution of the Quraysh in Medina and Mecca. And they were seeking protection under King Nagus or King Nagassi. And they were able to stay there in peace. It was the first time that Muslims could practice in relative peace without fear of persecution in Ethiopia. There was a second migration that was sent within the same year of over 100 Muslims. So at that time, you had roughly 120 Muslims in Aksum, Ethiopia, practicing Islam under the protection of King Nagassi. They left by 628 to return back to Mecca, but that their experience in Axis had converted and reverted some of the locals, and eventually King Nagasi himself, who was Christian, reverted to Islam, al-Islam. So again, it's of significant importance because of the early onset in Ethiopia, but also the idea that it's the first place that where Islam could be really practiced freely. What I try to do in the presentation is highlight the main civilizations. There's a lot of civilizations in Africa. We don't have time to discuss them all. So I talk about Ethiopia. I talk about the tutelage of the Moors. I talk about Mali, Ghana, and Songhai. But there are also the spread of Islam through a lot of other territories. So this is just kind of like one slide that shows you from the 7th century all the way to the 12th century with Islam spreading throughout the various regions of Africa, as far south as Mozambique and Malawi, the west of the Congo, etc. This is just an image, a picture, and it's built in 1670, the mosque in Tunisia. Okay, so I want to talk about the Moors because the Moors are most known for their influence in the United States in terms of what they did in Spain via the Iberian Peninsula, but also leading European explorers to the United States and European explorers studying under the tutelage of Moors in terms of the principles of democracy and things like that that really contribute to early America. But they began in the Maghreb region in North Africa. And at that time, the Sahara Desert was like fertile grassland. It wasn't a desert at all. And the Romans referred to them as barbarians, or the barbarian people. And then they became Berber people, and then the term later became equated with Moor, or Moors being black. And of course, they were Muslim males, mostly that went into Spain, but they were Muslims in this region. At the height of their empire, the land extended, including Africa, Asia, and Europe. And they were extremely important in using Islam towards feudal development. The importance of religion in Arab imperial expansion. So what Islam was able to do was able to combine a lot of different fractions of the population under one regime. The civilization grew very strongly in military and navy engineering and commercial and cultural achievements during this time. When you think about the role of the Moors in Spain, bringing them out of the period of darkness in terms of bringing medicine and lanterns to light the streetways, the idea of cleansing your body, the idea of domesticating your animals, like all of this came from North American Muslim men going into Spain and really cleaning up that region, and it really ushered in a new wave in Europe to get them out of the Dark Ages. We don't talk about that the way that we should. So most of the Moorish armies had conquered much of Portugal and Spain and some parts of France. They ruled Spain from 17 AD to the 13th century, and they increased the wealth of Spain, the literacy rate, and agricultural records. They started to institute common baths because they weren't bathing in Spain, and there was high levels of disease. Even if I don't know if you're familiar, but a lot of the early explorers to America thought that if you cleaned yourself, you were making yourself more susceptible to disease. So there was a lot of rampant disease because people weren't bathing and things like that in the cities because it wasn't a European tradition to bathe in that way. And so, this was pretty common. It was even common in the United States until the late 19th century. They erected the Castle of Gibraltar in 1160 and then the Great Mosque in 1193. Am I going too fast?
No.
Please. Slow down. We looked at the tutelage of the Moors and their role in Spain and in Europe, and now we're kind of coming back to the continent of Africa to look at the region of the Western Sudan. The Western Sudan was called the Lao Sudan, known as the land of blacks. So often when Europeans or non-blacks would greet black folk, they would give them names that signify their complexion or the degree of melanin. The Western Sudan encompassed a variety of territories, and they're all listed. They were seen as successor states, so although they were different cultures and ethnicities, that because they were within the same region, like when one kingdom fell, another one rose to replace it, and so they were seen as in succession of each other. Western Africa is often pointed to the area to denote Africa's greatness, particularly because when we talk about the slave trade, we like to talk about it post 1492. So we don't talk about the trading of Africans that went into Arabia. We don't talk about the trading of Africans that went into part of Asia. We tend to just speak about those who came to the United States or came to North and South America. And so to suggest that African Americans had no past or background, then there was a focus on West Africa. And it was like, well, everything that was accomplished in Africa was only limited to Ethiopia and Kenya, and y'all didn't come from there. And so that was the general belief and understanding. The idea that was trying to be promulgated, I should say more than what he actually said. So the Western Sudan tends to be highlighted as African Americans' direct lineage to Africa via these civilizations. Their principal commodity was trade, but they also had a strong agricultural base of cotton and mullet. They had early use of iron and cotton cultivation, cattle, horses, etc. When you think about Al-Islam in West Africa, by 738, in the Savannah region, Islam was introduced and began to spread. You had the Kingdom of Qatar and Senegal that had an early acceptance of Islam in 1850, and they implemented Sharia law, and it really created a uniform system in that territory. And then in narratives of explorers, etc., they describe this region as secure, peaceful, and tranquil relative to the surrounding communities. And it had a growth via commercial trade with the introduction of Islam. And then we shift a little bit to the ancient kingdom of Ghana, and a lot of what we know about the role of Islam in Africa comes from Ghana and Mali. But during the 5th century AD, Ghana was it was born, but it reached its peak in the 9th and 11th century. And at its height, it encompassed all these various territories. The major commodity in agriculture was gold. That the political role was mining and the distribution of gold. There were also craftsmen, so goldsmiths, blacksmiths, ironworkers, carpenters. So they had a greater demarcation of the skilled labor in that society in terms of relative to other parts of Africa. And a lot of times your specific occupation was influenced by your clan or your family. So your family were blacksmiths, your family were goldsmiths, etc. So it was kind of passed down the clan. Initially. By 1068, the king, he wasn't Muslim, but he employed Muslim interpreters, and most of his ministers and treasurers were Muslim, and they started to record the events in Arabic. By the 11th century, they had created 12 mosques with Jumu'ah prayers, intercongregational prayers that was occurring in the 12 mosques. They had an imam in each mosque. They had someone who called the Idan. They had paid reciters of the Quran. And so we see the establishment of culture and civilization growing out of the introduction of Islam into this region. And then after the fall of Ghana rose the rise of the Mali kingdom. And while Ghana dates back to about the 5th century, we kind of date Mali back to the 7th century. But when it was at its height, it was equal in strength to Western Europe. So by 1235, it reached its prime in the 13th and the 14th centuries, and it built on some of what was going on in Ghana with gold, with the mining of gold in Mali, and it really started to satisfy the sub-Saharan transfer of gold. So as Europe's economy started to develop, they were needing gold dinars, they were needing gold mint, and they were getting that gold from Africa. The Mandingo were the specific tribe that was experts in gold and weighing gold. They had intricate processes of twisted silk coils to measure the gold with the weighted scale. They embraced Islam early, but a lot of the region maintained their traditional values. So it was a combination of Islam with the indigenous values in that region. Here you see the beginning of Timbuktu. And I don't know about you, but I remember when I was younger, people would say Timbuktu like it was an insult. Like, where are you from, Timbuktu? Not understanding that the only reason we know the name is because of how revered Timbuktu was. The idea that people had to get scholarships and wait on lists to try to send their best, Europeans trying to send their best scholars to Africa to learn through these scholars. And so it's kind of interesting ironic how it turns its face, so it almost seemed like a slur, but in reality it was one of the first university systems, and it was an international system of learning, and most of it was based on the adoption of Islam because they were trying to record records, they were trying to write, and so initially a lot of these societies, not necessarily were just pre-literate because that's common at the time, but that there wasn't a strong mechanism for recording and keeping information and maintaining things, particularly storing it in a university system or like a library. When Al-Islam was introduced to Mali, King Sundiata was seen as a relatively weak Muslim, so he was a Muslim, but that he wasn't devout. He was more into the culture of the region. And when King Mansa Musa took over, he was considered very devout, and he's most known for his pilgrimage to Hajj. Now it's pretty common that people know who Mansa Musa is because he was topped this Forbes list of the richest man who ever lived. And so considering everyone who ever lived in existence, controlling for inflation, a Muslim, African, West African king is the richest man who's ever lived in society. And his wealth came from the gold in that region. And what he was able to do was extend Islamic understandings into policy via Sharia law, but also to divide and create more economic prosperity in the region. He established diplomatic relations, with Tunis and Egypt, and then of course in 1324 he made his famous Hajj to Mecca and went through Egypt. It was the first time that anything like that had ever occurred. He had an entourage, and some say 6,000 to 7,000 folks with him. He brought over 12 tons of gold, which translates into millions in today's currency. Billions in today's currency. And they were carried by over 80 camels. And he gave away so much gold in Egypt as sadaqah that it upset Egypt's economy, that they actually had a devaluation in gold of 25% because there was so much gold that it took them 25 to 30 years to regain the importance of gold. And so, like, when you think about our basic tenets, the idea that we have to take Shahada, believe in the oneness of God, and say that there's no God but God, and that Muhammad is his prophet, the idea that we have to think Hajj if we are able, the idea that we have to give sadaqah or charity. His life was an embodiment of that, and it's so interesting. We might know his name, but sometimes the story is disconnected to his belief, and his belief, like all of our beliefs, influence how we live our lives. So it's really interesting because people heard of him in his travels in making Hajj and coming back, and he brought back with him bricks, and he built mosques within Mali that were rebel now. But he literally put Mali on the map. People started to document Mali on their maps based on his pilgrimage and his Hajj to Mecca. It's pretty awesome. In terms of, so after the fall of Mali, you have the rise of the Songhai kingdom. And sometimes Songhai is spelled with an I or a Y at the end, just in case you look it up. But beginning in the early 8th century, at its apex, that it was the most advanced African civilization in that region. And really, it was the fall of Songhai that led to the destruction of the civilization so that it advanced the slave trade. So when you had strong kingdoms in Western Africa, it prevented Europeans, I should say this, I don't know how much people's level of understanding, but Europeans never had the military might to go in Africa and take over Africa. That the only reason that the slave trade was advanced to the degree that it was is because there was some cooperation from Africans that were warring with other Africans that would go into the interior of Africa as prisoners of war and take people from the interior of Africa and bring them outside to the West Coast for trade. Now, mind you that within Africa, while there was a system of slavery or indentured servitude, it was nothing like what existed in the United States. There is no evidence of any ancient African kingdom whose economic base was slavery or exploitation of labor in that way. And so what was being traded while we were trading humans, and I'm not going to say it was always a nice system, that it wasn't the same application of slavery that was in North America. The system in North America created a unique form of slavery that was based on color. It was based on a dehumanization. It was based on transferring that status from generations to your children, etc. There wasn't a lot of opportunities to manumit or buy your freedom or to come out of that system. So that's not what was known, that was not what was practiced in ancient Africa. But nonetheless, Europeans didn't go into Africa and just conquer all the Africans and take Africans. That's not what happened at all. They didn't have the capabilities to do that. And it really was Europeans' experience with the Moors that forced them to nationalize. Because the Moors were going into Europe and conquering parts of Europe, that the rest of Europe collectively started to gather into a nation. And so it really was, we didn't have people at that time going into Africa forcing any type of unification. Africa was so broad and vast in terms of geographic territory that initially, just like the Native Americans did see white men as challenging, they just saw them as another group to compete with resources. In Africa, we didn't see Europeans as a threat because they were just another group of people. And so, you know, you just kind of have to have that understanding a little bit when you look at how the destruction of this particular civilization really fueled the advancement of the transatlantic slave trade. But Africans, in this region were really the first to foster the idea of the university, of literature, of sciences. You had Sunni Ali in the 13th century that captured and expanded this territory. So he ended up capturing Timbuktu and Janneh. And his reign gave way to Askia Muhammad Touré, who made a similar pilgrimage to Mecca as King Mansa Musa. It wasn't as grand in stature, but he was recorded with a lot of respect. The king of Mecca gave him a sword and the title of Caliph of Western Sudan. And then afterwards, he proudly used the title of Hajj as part of his name. So he was, like Mansa Musa, was very devout in his practice and really kind of expanded the Songhai Empire around Islamic principles. And it really, the Songhai Empire is most known for their education system and how they contribute to the advancement of knowledge and learning. So I think we're almost wrapping up, y'all. I think that I have a couple more slides. So Islam development. Just in terms of like the summary of how Islam influenced African kingdoms, that it played a really strong role in the creation of their ideology in terms of development. In a lot of pre-organized religion African societies, while there was a strong level of spirituality, that it wasn't coupled with a growth for technology, meaning that if instead of looking for ways to irrigate the land to create more crops, then there would be just sometimes superstitious displays of things to try to create rain. And so with the introduction of the emergence of Islam, it allowed more structure in terms of organized religion, but it also resulted in technological development into those regions. In addition, it expanded literacy, it led to the collection of more sacred texts and institutions of knowledge and learning, which we've already talked about. It also allowed for various different fragments of the population to come together. So you saw the transcending family ties and clans and producing more states and, from that nation. I think I have one more slide. So this is the last slide. As all of these things were going on in Africa, you also had the Moors that were fighting in the various parts in Europe. And the Moors fell or were kicked out of Europe in 1492. They lost everything except Grenada. But an outgrowth was this with the birth of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And what they were able to establish was that after the death of Prophet Muhammad, the split into the fractions of Sunni and Shia, that there were some religious and political divisions that weakened, was akin to what happened in the weakening of the Christians in Europe, and they weren't really able to unite after that. And so you see the fall of the Maghreb Empire, the fall of the Moors, and then the growth of the European power, and then moving into North America and beginning the transatlantic slave trade, and then thus the transportation of billions, at least 12 billion persons of African descent coming to the continent of North and South and Central America, mostly to Brazil, and hence we're here now. So my goal was to highlight a little bit about what was going on in Africa before Islam, how Islam contributed to the growth of Africa, and how Al-Islam benefited directly African societies and civilizations. I hope I did that. If you all have any questions, you can ask. Hopefully, inshallah, I can answer them. Yes.
Hey, great job, also. What I want to know was, in your personal opinion, what's the difference culturally that you see Islamically in Ethiopia as opposed to?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a good question. I started to travel to Ethiopia when I felt like I saved money right at high school. So that was the first time I actually went. And then I started taking student loan money and going every time I could. But when I first went to Ethiopia, you can't tell the difference between Muslims and Christians, because everyone covers, everyone, it's not a lot of what, that was then though. America is glamorized abroad a lot, so everyone wants to be American. They have, Ethiopian BT that, they believe that we walk around like you know, like the music videos, like just, you know, loose clothes all the time, just listening to loud music and cussing and all of that kind of stuff. But initially, like, there wasn't a lot of distinction, like in terms of, and I think it says more about how Christianity is practiced there than how Islam is practiced there, because I think, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think that people who tend to be Muslim try to adhere to the principles of Al-Islam to the best of their ability, and I think that unfortunately Christianity here, like, has a lot of fluidity, like people practice in different ways, and they say they're Christian but they don't know the tenets, or they don't know nothing about the gospel, or they accept things that the Bible prohibits very loosely. And so that's why I think Christianity was different in Ethiopia, because it's more orthodox. That there tends to be a focus more on the Old Testament or the Injil. People don't just wait till Sunday to go to church. There's not. But I also, and I've been several times, so I want to say that I've noticed some changes in the different times that I've gone, because as of late, I think there is a lot more focus on, you know, seeing Jesus as the Son of God and seeking repentance through Jesus and Mary, and like the shirk, you know, in terms of saints and things that, you know, and because there is a lot of Asian and European aid in those regions, that a lot of that aid comes with forcing acceptance of other things. And so as they give, like, for example, there are some churches in Lalibela, which is like 5th century monolithic stone churches. It seems like one of the wonders of the world. And the first time I went to Lalibela, the churches, the paintings in the inside the church look like regular Ethiopian art. Like, people look, you know, melanated, and they're showing different pictures of the wall of what happened. And then when I went back, the people looked European. And I was asking my mom, like, what in the world, like, what happened? And she was like, oh no, they're you know, they're giving us money for the roads, and they just gave us these arts as gifts. And like, they didn't, like, we understand colonialism, we understand the effects of white supremacy and those ideas. So for me, it was extremely problematic. But there, I don't even think it was a clear understanding of what was being done in terms of why those gifts were given. So I think that we're all, I know this kind of, I don't know if that's answered your question,
No,
but it's kind of,
you kind of get, I understand, I get what you're doing.
yeah, so I just think that it doesn't seem as drastically different, my experience there, as Islam and Christianity is here. But that, it's limited to my experience, like I don't, yes.
Somebody gave an outstanding presentation. So originally, barbarianism wasn't associated or had that connotation.
At all.
What happened that you can think of?
Well, the reason why the Romans called them barbarians is because they followed a matrilineal line of lineage. So the idea was that they followed the mother. And because it was different than what the Roman system was, they thought they were barbarian. So it had nothing really to do with, it's almost like the same, I hope I want to take your question this way. It's like the idea that racism didn't predate slavery, but that racism was an outgrowth of the system of slavery. Meaning that we didn't go, Europeans weren't here saying, I hate black people, let's go to Africa and make them work, but that they wanted to expand the territories in the United States. And they tried to do it with whatever populations that they could. Unfortunately, African descendant folks had been doing it for the longest and were the most successful. So of course you know that they tried to, and I hope this is kind of answering your question maybe, but they tried to, when European colonists first came over here, they brought over European indentured servants. And they tricked them on boats, they got them out of their jails, their prisons, their insane asylums, etc. And they were forcing them to work under a period of time, and then they would give them land. There wasn't enough Europeans that were willing to come over here to do that work. And then they tried to enslave the indigenous populations. And what we see here is Europeans bringing over diseases in rampant numbers that in 90 years, millions of Native Americans died. And it's because, for one, Native Americans were nomadic people, and they weren't harvesting the land in that way. They weren't used to that type of labor. They didn't have to be, because they had widespread reign of the terrain. And so you see them largely killing them off, dying purposely genocide, but also with blankets, and also just not being used to that type of labor. But they also knew the land, so they could escape a little. European Columbus and explorers knew of the golds and things that were already going on in Africa, so they knew to go to Africa. Africans had already been in Portugal and Spain and had been engaged as slaves in those areas, so that the work ethic, quote unquote, of African Americans was well known. And Africans brought with them knowledge of certain crops that Europeans didn't have. So not only were we doing the work well, biologically our bodies were not susceptible to those diseases. We weren't dying off. We didn't fall ill to the diseases that Europeans brought. But we also, while European colonists or indentured servants could appeal to the crown, we couldn't appeal to anybody. There was no African territory or kingdom that we could appeal to that would argue on our behalf. So now you have people who look physically different, who can't run away and don't necessarily know the land to the degree to which the natives do. People who are biologically strong, so they're not dying to diseases. Physically, they're used to the work and they know how to do the work, and they have the ingenuity and how to do the work better, and they're expanding. So unfortunately, and then also the belief that they're pagan, so we can inflict as much harm and torture to them as possible because they're not of our same religious belief. It really created the perfect environment for, so initially, we're in Virginia. The first enslaved Africans that came here came as indentured servants along with Europeans. The first indentured servants got land in Virginia just like their white counterparts. And it really wasn't until, I think, 1690, where Virginia laws start to change. They say, well, your status depends on the race of your mother. Because we know that raping was going on the ships. It wasn't just post the ban where we said we're not going to go get Africans anymore in 1804. We had, white men had been taking liberty with black women as soon as we got here, so the production of those children expanded their wealth. So so the idea that we were, coming back to your point, that the idea of being barbarians or savage or anything was really a after effect explanation for the need for black bodies here because they were so successful economically. And so after Africans were successful in the slave trade, then the ideas of biological inferiority, the ideas of them being subhuman, the ape metaphor, and all those things became more promulgated because it was necessary to suggest that Africa had no past, they came from nothing, they didn't do anything, so we can use them in this way because we're really helping them out. Yeah, you're welcome.
That sounds like a beautiful presentation again. I was wondering, I don't know when the Crusades started, but did it have something to do with the Moors going into Europe?
Yeah, so 1711, so I don't know the exact date, but that's not necessarily my area. But it did influence the Crusade. What was going on? It's funny because when we think of Europe, we talk about Africa in terms of tribes, and we talk about Europe in terms of like nations, as if they were already nations. Like the same way that we created the idea of Europe, it wasn't Europe, it was individual territories and clans, and there wasn't a lot of economic growth and development. Like even the kings in Europe didn't have houses and castles. A lot of that came through the influence of the Moors, and we don't talk about that at all. We don't talk about. We like to believe that certain groups advanced in isolation. That Europe advanced to the degree to which Africa disadvantaged. And so it was really the exploitation of African resources, labor, humans that led to European advancement. That even in terms of naval know-how and machinery, a lot of that was learned from the Moors, but they just took it to the next level because they were trying to find more efficient ways to get Africans here. So they were driven by a different superstructure, but also mentality because they had an early inception of a desire for capitalism, I should say, the desire to expand their territory at any cost. And that idea is really kind of foreign in African traditions. Although there was some shared conquering, it was a general belief that the land belonged to God, by Allah. Like you couldn't own the land, so you can't, that's why you don't see, even in the most advanced civilizations in ancient Kemet or Egypt and Ethiopia, you don't see the shift to capitalism because the mindset wasn't the same as it was in Europe. And some of it had to do with, I think some of it has to do with the nature of indigenous cultures, that when you are living, or when the first people are in an environment where their basic needs are accounted for, so if you're in a tropical climate of Africa or South America or etc., you can get berries, you can get fruit, you can get trees and make your house, you can do whatever you want. But if you're in Europe and there's a short time frame where you can plant and harvest in order to get food because the climate changes, then for one, you're more focused on time. And since we talk about colored people's time, the deadline was real for them. Because if they didn't have a schedule largely regulated by the female's menstrual cycle, they would not be able to harvest land. It would have to be just trying to kill and hunt whatever they're going to eat. So they had to be more structured around a timeline and a time frame and getting things done in a certain time. And so their principal focus was the acquisition of the things that they needed. But when you have people in another territory who already have what they need,
Right.
their principal focus is family and relationship because they have what they need. So they're interested in how they're going to relate to each other. And like, you see it in how we greet each other. You know, like everything about us is symbolic to the family. Everything we do is about, because we, alhamdulillah, we're blessed with not having to focus to the same degree on those immediate needs. And it creates a different mindset and subset that continues from generation to generation, where if you're thinking about conquest and exploitation and needing to get resources, then you're going to behave in one way. Like if you think about it, Africans and Europeans had access to a lot of the same materials. There's more resources in Africa than anywhere. So the gold, the copper, the diamonds, etc. But what we were doing with the gold and the metals were creating statues in the likeness of God. We weren't creating guns. Like we got guns from, we weren't creating weaponry in that way. And so it speaks to the mentality and the mindset to some degree of why when we came together there was such a clash, because you have societies that are organized very differently.
Right.
And even though, and it's not, I think that I hate the word of development and advancement because it's relative to yours. Like what you see as success and advancement, if you feel like if everything you're doing is trying to create homage to something greater than you, then that might be advancement. But if you feel like with that same material you have to get your next man's stuff because you don't know where your meal's gonna come from, then it seems like technologically you're further along, but how much further along are you really?
Right.
Yeah.
I was gonna say it was a joke that most Native Americans selling land to, they would laugh and say, the land belongs to God.
Yeah.
And it was a statement I remember reading a book, and the Indians saying, next you'll say that's his airspace.
Yeah.
Which they do now.
Yeah. It's true.
Now, I'm sorry.
Did you want to elaborate yourself on something?
Oh, no, you can go ahead and I'll follow up.
You sort of answered my question and created other questions in the process. My initial question was, in the same way that we have to educate and re-educate African Americans here, and my question was, is that same need in Africa and around religion? And when you start talking about the changing of the face and all of that, you sort of hit on that. And then a little deeper, in your research and in your personal back and forth, is the concept of Islam and our connection to it? Because like for African Americans here, for me specifically, I'm just going to speak for myself, because it was chosen, it seems to I can connect with it more because I don't have to be.
Yeah.
Right? So is that some same kind of feeling?
For other Black American Muslims, you mean? Like, is it more sacred because it's chosen? Because we're
In
reversed?
Africa,
Oh.
their respect of the religion.
Yeah. I don't know if I can answer that. I don't know.
And I asked that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure.
I asked that question because you talked about how resources is connected to the religious influence. So is my religion for sale?
Yeah.
Kind of.
And I think that we see that, like, with the newest country, the creation of South Sudan, like, we see the problematic natures of the application of Islam in different regions, and particularly as it relates to culture and resources. So I think I think it's vastly different experiences in different areas. So I don't know how someone who's first, who didn't choose this, who was born on the continent and was born into an Islamic family, feels about their role and their connection to Al-Islam in Africa relative to someone here. That would be a really interesting research area. The other thing you said about the first question, about the faces, was about Africans and how they perceive. So is there a need for Africans to understand? I definitely think so. I think that we in America, for whatever reason, sometimes just focus on how the institutions of chattel slavery impacted us, how white supremacy impacts us, and we think that we have such a different experience than other people. But even in Ethiopia, the only country outside of Sierra Leone that wasn't colonized by Europeans, there's the same mindset that is going on there that is happening here in terms of light skin colorism, the idea of like favoritism towards the light skin, the belief that particularly now the perpetuation of Jesus being the form of a man who is white, and like the idea that, I mean, that is real as they are now here, you know, there as it is here. So I think that, and I think that some of it's newer there. Like I think that with the desire to be more developed and to be like America, then not only are they trying to adopt our economic stability, but they're trying to adopt our philosophical principles and our religious principles, even those that are vastly incorrect. So even like towards the removing of natural herbs and things that you had access in Africa, but you're now trying to get them pharmaceutical because it's like, it creates a crazy cycle of imbalance. So I definitely think that there is a problematic nature of Africans even on the continent, and sometimes it's even worse for Africans, and I consider myself African and African American, because because we're from Africa, and because we have that connection, we don't think that we have those same issues. But we articulating the same narrative of that mindset, and we have, you know, beauty products that are geared towards lightening our skin, straightening our hair, that sell more in Africa than anywhere else, and they sell in Asia as well. Like, so it's the system of this white supremacy, that's what we have to call it. That mindset, it impedes every geographic territory. So it affects Asia, it affects Latin America. I mean, the South American example, for example, what's going on in the Caribbean, and this is a slight departure because they don't have the Islamic influence, but in terms of, although in the Caribbean and South America, their institutions of slavery were vastly different from the United States. That they had more of an ability to maintain their culture than African descended folks here. And because there was not as many European descendants in those regions, that they encouraged intermingling. And so you had the quadrant, you had these blended societies of various degrees of blackness based on this combination. You know, in Virginia, in America, we had, you can't, you know, like you could not, there was miscegenation laws, so you couldn't marry. You weren't supposed to, I mean, you know, white men could rape black women with immunity, but that in terms of their children, you know, we had the one drop rule, so they were all considered black because whiteness was based on the illusion of privilege. Now, whiteness isn't about culture, it's not about language, it's not about your any of that. Whiteness is about securing benefits that others cannot secure. And so even the idea, we kind of talk about blackness sometimes, it's like we made it up, like, well, it's not a real term, why do we go from black and African American, and we are really critical of our desires of self-determination. But what we don't also understand is that whiteness was made up. That whiteness was made up simultaneously post, you know, 1920s, after the wars, to secure privileges in a way that it was no longer beneficial to say you're Polish or Irish or Scottish, etc. And it was no longer beneficial to discriminate against Italians because they needed whites to group up so blacks couldn't get those jobs and blacks couldn't live in those areas. So we see whiteness being created around not your ethnicity, not your language, but the idea that you can belong to a group of people that can get access to things that people who are darker than you can't get access to. And I mean, but you know, they trick ourselves into believing that we're problematic because we keep changing our names and we don't know who we are, as if that their structure or their construction of race is any more solid than our construction. I don't know if that's about explaining.
Yeah, well, I think Islam is a cure to.
No, alhamdulillah, indeed.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I do want to make a couple comments on what you just said. So it eventually got to Ethiopia too, even though it didn't originally get there.
Yeah.
And they weren't colonized, but it eventually got there, which is right around now.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. All right, also, you know that when the Moors got kicked out of Spain, that they stole their money too and financed the Columbus trip.
Yeah. Like, Christopher, like when we think about, and it's so crazy how we're taught, and my children can attest because I get on them with their homework, like overlooking to make sure they're learning the right information all the time. Because what we learn about these individuals, like, and what we're taught to cherish, are values that you wouldn't want anybody to have. And so Christopher Columbus was involved in the slave trade. Like, he was already he was in South America involved in the slave trade. Like, not only just what he did with the Native Americans or what contributed to his discovery of America, but his presence before that. Like, and had it not been for his knowledge and his interaction with Africans, they wouldn't have got over here. There's evidence of, not just that, but there's evidence of way before Columbus of Africans and African presence in America, thousands of years before. You know, like the Olmec heads, the pyramids in Peru, we have all of this evidence of Africans' ability to come here and trade and leave and not say I want to conquer, not say I need more territory, not say I need to take over. So I think it again speaks to the superstructure where it's a different, it's a different type of mindset and mentality that is void of spirit, that at the time was void of various levels of spirituality. Because even if it wasn't Islam or Christianity, in most traditional African societies, it was a strong spirituality that connected the people to revere what created them. And so it regulated what they did and didn't do, even if it wasn't offering salat, even if it wasn't, praying asking Jesus for forgiveness, that it was still a nature of spirituality. And it still suggests that African people, or at least in African Americans, are the most spiritual people, like on Gallup polls, in terms of saying they feel connected to the Most High, that they've had these experiences, etc. So it's something I think that is innate. I think it's innate within all of us, but I think that different environmental conditions influenced how much we tapped into that.
And just one more, that 13 to 15% of the
And
people that were brought up, that's all percentage was of?
Well, now mind you, we begin with 1492, we begin with 1619 as a date. And so when we talk about things like this, there are some people who suggest there are only 10 million Africans that left the continent of Africa. There are some people who say there's 12 million. Some people talk about the collateral damage and say that those numbers are 200 million. And so I think it's one of those things where we don't know, we have evidence of 13 to 15%, but we don't actually know, but we do know that there were attempts to maintain Islamic principles here, like throughout the institution of chattel slavery. And Ishmael, maybe you can point to the book that you were talking about, The Sword of Allah, in terms of speaking to the ways in which enslaved Africans maintained Ramadan, like doing slavery, maintained fasting during that period and adherence to Islamic principles in America.
That's one thing I was going to say with that servant of Allah is that she was talking about the number of Muslims that came and that it is somehow hidden how many Muslims were here. The reason we have so much knowledge of it is because the Muslims that came here, like the Mandingos and the other ones, was because they were scholars. They knew Arabic and they were warriors, so they wrote down things, and that's the reason we have knowledge of them. And the author of that book said that it's extensive research that needs to be done. But she was giving estimates of how many it was too, because nobody really knows. For some reason, it was hidden. One other thing I read is that Ethiopia was mentioned in holy books more than any other nation. And I wonder if you had any insight on what that significance is.
Well, I think that, I don't know if I know why I chose to reveal it in that way in the holy books, but I think that because, it had a certain level of advancement and achievements that was unknown in other places. One thing about the geographic territory of Africa was that you had nomadic hunters and gatherers, you had clansmen, and then you had feudalism, all existing like various things in the environment contributed to the level of economic and technological development. Whether I know why it's mentioned more. No, but I do know, and I was like that Bilal, was from Ethiopia, that there is the first person to call the Yadan, that there is strong connection in the Bible and in the Quran mentioning of Ethiopia. I don't know if I know why.
I was just going to ask your opinion if you have any, just come to me.
I think because, as a cradle of civilization.
That was sitting out of my tongue.
One other question I wanted to know, was there any evidence of Islam before the Prophet? In Africa?
In Africa. Well, I've seen, and I don't have them in front of me, and I'd probably have to look, but I've seen statues that predate the 7th century that show people in Sujood. And so, that's why I love Islam. That's why I love that I'm a Muslim, because it makes so much sense, the belief that every nation had a prophet and Allah didn't send different stories. And so how much of that information was recorded or our interpretation of it might change slightly, but the idea of submitting to the will of Allah is something that we've done inherently and that we've done for generations. And so, yes, I think it was way before, I think that there's evidence, but how much evidence there is or what I can point to, I'm not as certain. But yeah, I definitely would say, but I also want to say that we haven't begun to do the archaeological research necessary in Africa, like archaeological digs and things like that, because Europeans have been coming over and taking stuff. And so every time they excavate something, they find another city, they find another statue, they find another mummy, another person that was older than what they perceived before. So like now when you go, and there's, I mean, I've been and there's like a place where they say it's Nicosia Salva or Queen of Sheba's swimming pool. And like, you can't go over, they block it off because Ethiopia doesn't necessarily have the resources to do all the digs and stuff themselves, but they don't want anyone else coming over finding stuff either. And so, I mean, it's almost like the same idea that there's things detailed in the Quran about the makeup of the earth and the oceans that only Allah would know, and that we're just now finding out. And so I think that as we explore more into these regions and find more things, then it's gonna support the idea of a creator, and as opposed to, you know, some scientific study disconnected to something else.
Okay, I have two questions. Before I start with those questions, I just want to say alhamdulillah and thank you for what you gave me today. Pretty sure you gave everyone else the same thing. Probably equally as important, or maybe more important, as the information, the new knowledge that you gave me was the perspective on concepts that I thought I already understood.
Alhamdulillah!
Yeah, so alhamdulillah for that. Okay, so on the last comment you just said about how Allah has all the knowledge and He bestows it upon us, and how anything we think we know is just something that Allah probably already told us in the Quran already anyway. Are there any, I think this may apply more for like lower education, educators, but as a professor, are there any teachings that you have to disseminate that are contrary to Al-Islam?
No, alhamdulillah. Like, once you're at a university level, you have so much leeway in what you do. And so,
more for high schoolers.
yeah, I had created a course called Sankofa, Africana Intellectual Thought and Economic Development, because I was really interested in African philosophy and how economic development was influenced it, and I never took a course like that, and I had been reading all these books like Walter Rodney and Marion Marable about how Europe was only developed to the degree that it undeveloped Africa. And then in doing that, I was studying, I started to kind of have discussions about Islam and things like that. And so then I was like, I put slides about Prophet Muhammad and Islam in my lectures, but it wasn't, so there's a lot of autonomy in the creation of, you know, so I thank God, I don't have any of those pressures, but I do think that at the lower level, you know, they definitely have to be mindful of what they teach. And I mean, they have no freedom, very little freedom in terms of, but how can anything be contrary to Islam? Like, I mean, the basic principles and the basic ideas, like every time we think, like the scientific discoveries, if anything, support the, like whether we say it's dark matter or whatever, whether we say, what's the molecule, what's the name, starts with the H, the one principle, like the God particle, it's called something with an H. I forgot what it's called. But the idea being that we found the existence now of the God particle. But it's like, it only points to the fact that there was nothing and then there was something, you know what I mean? And so from nothing to something, so, you know, like only a creator could create that. Somebody that wasn't born or didn't have children, that didn't begin and didn't end, like, that's pretty, I mean, I think it's pretty amazing. And I think, and just on a personal, like, in terms of the flow into Islam, like, that's what got me. Like, the idea that other schools of thought don't offer that clarity. They don't offer the ability to clear up stuff that doesn't make sense. And the fact that we recite the Quran and people know it, like there was no changes, there's no versions, there's no kingdom that said do it differently. I mean, people might have different interpretations of translations or schools, but that the essence of what Allah passed down to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is still there. And like whether you were born in the 8th century or now, like you had access to that. And this is kind of a side, but it reminds me of like the Dogon people in West Mali and how they were talking about Sirius B and the star, and then like 10 years ago we found out, and we're like, oh, we made this great discovery, and then we like, oh, thousands of years, they were talking to the star thousands of years, like how do they have this knowledge? Like, so it almost feels like that, like we're just, the more we learn, the more evidence is going to be of Allah's creations.
Excellent presentation, and inshallah, I hope to be here for part 2.
Okay, I gotta figure out what part 2 is, but we can do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
My second question.
Oh, okay. I told you don't ask me anything, Costa.
I'm sorry. Okay, in the said, well, you presented that there was spirituality in religions prior to Al-Islam, I think you said.
Yep.
And I was
Well, prior to organized Al-Islam. So there was a, yeah, so monotheism existed on the continent
Right.
back, yeah.
So they already had their own sets of beliefs. So I was wondering if you could maybe call out by name some of the spirit, and if they were just spiritually motivated, or if they were actually like the structure of religion like we see it.
Okay. So like, for example, most people who point to ancient African civilizations speak to Kemet, and they speak about the Phoenician or the Assyrian spiritual system. And there's a lot of discussion about parallels between the Assyrian stories of Peru, Isis, and Jesus, the idea of Jesus Christ. And so there are a lot of people who say that, you know, Christianity came from that story. And so Osirian belief systems, in terms of the personifications of Allah or God into various, entities. Some people say that they're attributes, like they're not really, there's no such thing as Osset in the way, like they're not praying to Osset, they're praying to the feminine quality of something, of that aspect of Allah. Like, that's one belief system. And then you have Orisha. There's a lot of indigenous variations of beliefs. But one thing that's interesting, even in that, like even when people try to posit the idea of Islam being contrary to something like that, in essence, even in studying the Osirian system or understanding that there is aspects of, because sometimes when you do a side-by-side comparison, it's very strong that at the age of 30 this happened, that the idea of a dying and a resurrection, the idea of being gone into the wilderness for a certain amount of years, like there's a lot of strong parallels, and not just in Hinduism, and a lot of Buddhism, there's relative parallels to various schools of thought about how the Messiah, like the specific characteristics of the Messiah. But when you think about Allah sending prophets to every nation, then it makes sense. Like, there's no confusion in that. But if you take away Islam, then of course it seems extremely confusing. And my journey was extremely confusing. I was studying a whole bunch of everything, trying to find the truth. And I think that Islam is the only thing that, for me, that just presents it in a way that is logical. And because our religion requires dalil. Because we're required to question and have proof and have understanding in a way that sometimes in other religions, if you have, I used to be Christian, like Orthodox Christian in terms of how we were raised in my Ethiopian household, you couldn't really ask her, but when I was like, who was Jesus praying to? Like, Mom, somebody please tell me who Jesus was praying to. And like, that was, the shundog. Like, no one wanted to speak to that. But, it only makes sense in the context that there is something greater than, like, he never, Isa or Jesus never said, I'm the Son of God. Like, that's something we invented. And that's why I think that monotheism and tawhid is so important, like, because when you can't associate anything, there's no partners, like there's nothing that can be associated with our Creator. Nobody can hype me.
Hey, we see I just got a battery phone.
So this is part two. I just decided.
Okay.
The part two is going to be the comparison between Asian African religions and the subsequent Christian religion. And just because of Picasso's question, and something I just seen recently that did a significant comparison to show things like even the pontiff, the hat that he wears, the symbols, all go back to ancient Africa. And even, like, it was so much symbolism between the two. This is where Christians and Catholicism and all of them get these things from, and you see them very prevalently on the walls with the high trophies.
And you see that in earnest, every idol created sculpture. In most religious schools of thought, in terms of the personification of those, have been in blackface. Yes. That the original Buddha is in black, like the initial statues of Madonna and baby Jesus are in black, and we have those artifacts. So it's not, only we think that. We're the only ones who don't understand the influence of, and it makes sense when if you have a civilization where everything grew out of course the original of that is going to mirror that civilization. So even if it's in shirk, people are creating things in the likeness of themselves. So that's why the oldest of those features look like people in those areas. Like, yeah.
I just want to make a point, and I'm sure Hanif will agree with me. You kind of relate her to the doctor that, what was his name? Sales. Remember how he was searching, and then when he found out Islam, he sounds just like she do right about now. Because she been searching. And then when she got out of Islam, it's like, y'all just another person now.
I don't know.
Just another person.
Obviously, we were all searching.
Oh yeah, well,
All of us are converted, we were
yeah,
searching.
true.
Yeah.
One more question.
Email that to me.
Oh, yes, yes. So maybe if you want a copy of the presentation, you can just write your name down on, your email address and your name, and I'll send it to you. Oh, I probably have some of your emails. Did y'all get, y'all not, nobody didn't say one thing about porn? Oh, wait, I forgot, excuse me, Erin is a former student of mine at Old Dominion. Well, she's still at ODU, but she's not in my classes anymore. But she's doing a project on Al-Islam, and she would like, well, I'll let you talk because you know more about it than I do. But if you have time maybe to talk to her, she might have a couple questions for you.
Oh, yeah, so I'm doing a few projects actually, but they're on just Islam. I'm not really familiar with it. And so I don't know anything about it.
So what do you want, like, do you have questions prepared that you would like to ask people, or you just want people to talk to you? Like, what do you want?
I think it would be helpful if I could both just talk to somebody or people here, and then maybe a separate time also. So I have some questions that my professor wanted me to ask, but I don't have them.
Okay. So if anyone has time, please do your.
I also wanted to say, for the two sisters that came last week, I talked to them, and they just wanted me to let everybody here know, to thank them, to thank all of us for how comfortable we made them. And they said they were very afraid to come into the masjid, but it was such, such a blessing, and they were very appreciative. Alhamdulillah.
It really was something about that fear.
Mm-hmm.